Welcome to this very special show on Vajpayee's legacy, and we have all our guests lined up. We're talking about his defense policy, we're talking about his foreign policy and his vision for the economy as well. We have Mr. S. Narayan with us, who was Finance Secretary when Mr. Vajpayee was in the Prime Minister's office. Mr. Narayan, my question to you now, opening up of FDI, introduction of Fiscal Responsibility Act, would these be remembered as keystones of his economic legacy?
Let us not forget that even the FERA Act was removed during that time. FERA Act was the FEMA Act, which is a much more milder act and much more, I would say, much less harsh. So he was very open to foreign investment. The FIPP became much more a body which could give clearances. And the positive move towards, particularly in the financial sector, the kind of openings that SEBI was able to make is quite significant.
And let me go now to Mr. Baijal. Mr. Baijal, would you agree when we say that Mr. Vajpayee was somebody who was ahead of his times, even when it came to economic decisions? In fact, we were reading just a short while back that when it came to GST, his government had thought about GST 17 years ago, but they couldn't get political support.
Yes, he always thought ahead of time. When we started telecom reforms in 2003, he knew that if the reforms are implemented properly, the sector would grow. And within a short period, it grew 100 times. So he knew very well that Indian money, whether public sector or private sector, could not do this reform. And therefore, he encouraged FDI, he encouraged private investment. And you'd be surprised by one figure. When I started, telecom was 90% public sector. When I left, actually a little later, telecom was 10% public sector. The rest was private money. But he was very particular. Make the rules. Because if private sector is coming, they have to come according to a rule and not in an off-the-cuff manner. So we didn't have any problems.
Right. And he was very clear as far as foreign policy was concerned. And I'm sure during that period, they faced a lot of international pressure as well, especially during the second Pokhran nuclear test. And Mr. Kaju, I'd like to ask you about that. I'm sure that was a period when Vajpayee PMO faced a lot of international pressure, sanctions from the United States and Japan, but that also opened up a new era with the United States and our strategic partnership. In fact, a few years later, we went on to sign the nuclear deal.
I think after the Pokhran test, Mr. Vajpayee and his very able diplomatic team, Mr. Jaswant Singh, Mr. Brijesh Misra, the then Foreign Secretary, were able to convince the Americans that India was a responsible international player, that India was too large to be treated as some kind of a nuclear pariah. And we demonstrated this responsibility completely during the Kargil, during Kargil, and thereafter, the Americans realized that India had to be co-opted on the high table in a de facto manner, and if not de jure, and de jure, of course, is some way ahead, because we still aren't members of the UN, permanent members of the UN Security Council, and UN Security Council reform is still some time away. But it was because of this that the foundation of the strategic Indo-US strategic partnership was laid. One other point here, Mr. Vajpayee was not saddled with any ideology when it came to India's strategic interests. His reading of our strategic interests demanded that we conduct the tests and that we become an overt nuclear power. And he did that. And thereafter,
Mr. Kaju,
the diplomacy won us respect all over.
Absolutely. And Mr. Kaju, I'd like to quote N.K. Singh, his former secretary on economic issues. He said, Mr. Vajpayee could not be boxed within the narrow confines of any party ideology or set patterns. And probably that dictated his foreign policy as well. But General Malik, coming to you and just talking about Kargil once again, I believe at one point you and the Air Force were ready to go across the LOC and carry out strikes. But Mr. Vajpayee was very clear that was not to happen. But Kargil also raised his stature, not just with the Americans, but internationally as well. But would you like to talk about your conversations when you urged him to allow the Army and the Air Force to go across and carry out strikes across the LOC?
I must also mention about Pokhran. I thought that that was the best contribution of the Vajpayee as Prime Minister in our defense policy, because we became nuclear nation and the whole nation became a lot more confident than it was before. Now, coming back to your question, yes, the political objective that was given to us was to throw out the Pakistani army, which had entered our territory, across the line of control. But there was this restraint put on us that you will not cross the line of control, our international border. Now, apparently, that was, he wanted a restrained policy to be followed during that period. And he did not want people to start thinking that India has become a rogue nation after carrying out the nuclear test, etc. So I thought it was a very responsible policy that he followed. And yes, during the war, at one stage, we felt that we should go across the line of control. We approached him, but he did not give us that permission.
All right. Let me go across to Mr. Kajju. Mr. Kajju, just talking about the Agra summit, General Musharraf said that he felt betrayed after the Agra summit, and that was a moment to be seized because they were very close to signing an agreement on Jammu and Kashmir. What happened at that point in time, and how did Mr. Vajpayee feel when the Agra summit fell flat?
It is not for me to speak about details of the Agra summit. There is things like the Official Secrets Act, which have to be honored. But I will say this, that General Musharraf must deeply introspect about why Agra turned out the way it did. If there is someone responsible and someone who needs to, again I repeat, introspect, it's General Musharraf.
But do you feel that at that time there could have been an agreement on Kashmir? That could have been a historic decision? Do you feel that?
I will not go into details. I don't think, I think we were discussing in a larger India-Pakistan roadmap.
Okay.
Let us not forget that Jammu and Kashmir is a core issue for Pakistan. For India, it has always been symptomatic of the problems that Pakistan has with India. And all these stem from what is called the Nazariya-e-Pakistan, of which the Pakistan army thinks it's the ultimate guardian.
All right. All right. I guess, Mr. Kajju, a lot of decisions, be it on foreign policy, be it on defense, be it on telecom and the economic front, really laid out the template for future governments. And I'm going to put this last question to Mr. S. Narayan. Mr. Narayan, would you agree that if Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao ushered in reforms, economic reforms, it was Mr. Vajpayee who set the ground template for the Congress governments, for the two Congress governments, and then the Narendra Modi government?
Absolutely, absolutely. Those were the years of real implementation of reforms between 1999 and 2004, when actually a lot of ideas which had been left half done were got completed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Narayan. And I'd really like to thank all our guests. This is Team Vajpayee on CNBC TV 18 telling about the life and times of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, explaining his defense strategy, his strategy towards Pakistan, his foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States, and some of his key economic decisions which are having an impact even today. We'd like to thank Mr. Pradeep Bejal for joining us, Mr. Kajju, General Malik, and Mr. S. Narayan as well. Thanks for watching.